So welcome everyone. I've got a little bit of a frog in my throat, but I wanted to do two things. First of all, just mention to everyone that for those of you in the working group, we're going to be sending out each week not only information, but a little news piece, a little bit of information about Toni Morrison's work, its significance today, and the way people respond to it. And I think this week you saw that we sent out an attachment about the Toni Morrison Society, which is a society that's quite active in the United States and elsewhere in the world, and their Bench by the Road project. This Bench by the Road project was launched in 2006 on the occasion of Toni's 75th birthday. And the Bench by the Road is taken from Morrison's remarks in a 1989 interview where she spoke of the absences of historical markers that help remember the lives of Africans who were enslaved, something that Walter Johnson is going to be helping us with today. And she wrote about how her fifth novel, Beloved, served this symbolic role. There's no place you or I can go to think about or not think about, to summon the presences of or recollect the absences of slaves. There's no suitable memorial or plaque or wreath or wall or park or skyscraper lobby. There's no 300-foot tower. There's no small bench by the road. There is not even a tree scored, an initial that I can visit, or you can visit in Charleston or Savannah or New York or Providence, or better still on the banks of the Mississippi. And because such a place doesn't exist, the book had to. And we wanted to let you know about this because a couple of these benches have appeared nearby. One of these benches is in Concord, Massachusetts. Might be fun for some of us to go up there, see the bench, sit by the bench and remember, break bread together. And apparently there's an upcoming placement sometime this month, maybe it's already taken place in Lincoln, Massachusetts, of another one of these benches by the road. And so that was just a little tidbit of news we wanted to share with you to kind of broaden our sense of Toni Morrison's significance. This week we're very fortunate to have Walter Johnson, who is the Winthrop Professor of History and a Professor of African and African American Studies here at Harvard. When we were planning this workshop, this working group, we wanted to reach out to other people in the university beyond the Divinity School. And Diana Sorensen, the Dean of Humanities, and I were speaking, and she said, you've got to try to get Walter Johnson. So Walter is a great teacher, and he's done some very significant historical work in American slavery, and can be a resource for us to think about the historicity, historical conditions that Toni Morrison is writing about in her novels and in her critical works. And so we reached out to Walter, and as I said last week, he said to me, hey, what I do is going to be sketchy. And I said, well, that's good because everybody is sketchy when it comes to Toni Morrison's work, but I think is going to be a little bit more than sketchy. If you have a chance to look on the History Department website about Walter, it's got the coolest picture of all. I think certainly in the whole History Department, and cooler than anybody in the Divinity School. So you got to check out my man's photograph here. And he says something about his work that I just want to repeat as part of the introduction. He says, my work on the 19th century focuses on slavery, capitalism, and increasingly imperialism. My book, Soul by Soul, used the slave market as a way into the fantasies, fears, negotiations, and violence that characterized American slavery. And by the way, this book, Soul by Soul, the full title of it is Soul by Soul, Life Inside the Antebellum Slave Market. I don't know how, this book won every award that could be given that year. It won the 2000 John Hope Franklin Prize of the American Studies Association. It won the 2000 Avery Craven Award and co-winner of the 2000 Frederick Jackson Turner Award of the Organization of American Historians. It was the winner, the 2000 Book Prize of the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic, and it was awarded the Thomas J. Wilson Prize of Harvard University Press. So sketchy as he may seem, there's a lot of depth in these particular sketches. And I like what Ira Berlin said about this book, because I think it gives us a good introduction to what we're going to hear today. Ira Berlin said, "The slave pen lay at the depths of slavery's hell, and no one has explored that abyss better than Walter Johnson. Soul by soul, brilliantly bears the base meaning of chattel bondage and, by extension, antebellum Southern society." Southern society. Walter goes on, "Since the book, my work has followed two courses. On the one hand, I've written a series of essays about social and historical theory, on notions of time in American slavery, on the idea of agency as the organizing theme of scholarship on slavery, on theories of capitalism and slavery, and on the idea of reparations for slavery as a historical narrative. On the other hand, I've been working on a history of the Mississippi Valley between the Louisiana Purchase and the Civil War." This is his new book coming out soon, and it's entitled River of Dark Dreams. River of Dark Dreams, Slavery, Capitalism, and Imperialism in the Mississippi Valley. One of the things that I like about this upcoming book, in which he uses slave narratives, popular literature, legal records, and personal correspondence, he recreates the harrowing details of daily life under Cotton's dark dominion. But at the center of the story, and I know this will appeal to many of us here at the Divinity School who are working on understanding the relationship between existential anthropology and also interpretive frameworks. At the center of the story are the enslaved peoples who pulled down the forests, planted the fields, picked the cotton, who labored, suffered, and resisted on the dark underside of the American dream. So we're very grateful, Walter, that you've come over from the history department to talk to us today about slavery's ghost, Toni Morrison, and the political economy of slavery. Please welcome Walter Johnson.
I think we'd probably all be better off if he just kept talking. As a Catholic, I want to begin with a confession, which is that I'm not a Morrison scholar. So I stand before you as a fan. I'm a Morrison fan. And I feel a little bit like I used to have these, when I used to have to go to church every week with my family, I used to sit there and imagine getting called out of the congregation to serve some special purpose. It wasn't to preach, I'm afraid, or to bear witness. It was usually involved some kind of lurid 8-year-old fantasy of terrorists attacking the Newman Center in Columbia, Missouri. But I feel a little bit like that today, like I've been called out as a fan to come up and testify to my fandom. And so that's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how it is that playing in the dark in particular has helped me think about the tradition of writing about slavery. And then I'm going to talk a little bit based on that kind of critique of the existing literature on slavery, which is going to be very broad brush. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of slavery, a little bit about the world of Beloved. Okay. I want to start with the idea of playing in the dark, the idea from playing in the dark, of literature as being haunted by blackness, of there being an invisible blackness, blackness pushed to the margin, which invisibly orchestrates texts. And the literature that I want to talk about today, in brief, is the literature of Western political economy, and I want to talk particularly about Karl Marx and particularly about capital. Although if one sat down to do this kind of analysis, Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations, you could do the exact same sort of analysis that I'm going to do. like Adam Smith, Karl Marx in Capital treated slavery as the past to capitalism's present. I don't know how familiar you are with Capital, but there's a sort of a baseline idea that I'm sure you all have been exposed to at one time or another, that capitalism, that slavery was succeeded by capitalism. That there was slavery, and then after slavery, perhaps through the Civil War, perhaps through the historical progress of the British Empire, industrial capitalism came to historically triumph over slavery, to put an end to slavery. Well, that idea is not, it doesn't just emerge out of thin air. It emerges out of the tradition of Western political economy. It emerges out of the writing of Adam Smith and out of the writing of Karl Marx. So the two great traditions of Western political economy both share this narrative structure. That slavery is succeeded by, and in fact is ended by, the emergence of capitalism. That capitalism and slavery are, number one, analytically distinct, two different things, right? And number two, temporally successive. In Capital, Marx talks about slavery at the end of the book. After about 800 pages, this is only a volume 1 I'm talking about. After about 800 pages in the section about primitive accumulation, what he calls primitive accumulation. And what primitive accumulation is about the accumulation of capital that provided the reservoir of investment capital that produced the Industrial Revolution. Most specifically in that section on primitive accumulation, Marx is talking about the process of the enclosure of the commons in Great Britain, right? Taking common land, planting hedges on it, privatizing it, and making it thus into capital. He also, in that section, in a paragraph which is not quite a throwaway, but is not an integral part of the analysis, talks about slavery as a modality of primitive accumulation, of the accumulation of capital in advance of industrialization. So slavery in Marx is a ghost, right? It's something which existed in the past and is present in a non-obvious fashion within the fabric, within the capital of industrial development. And in fact, Marx, Capital is a book which is full of ghostly metaphors, right? It is a book which begs to be analyzed in terms of haunting. That ghost, however, in Marx, that haunted by slavery ghost, that haunted by blackness ghost, is banished from most of the text. Banished most particularly in the first section of Capital, which is, if you have read any of Capital, what you have read is the critique of the commodity form, which begins the first volume of Capital. It's about 120 pages long. It is where Marx outlines the distinction between use value and exchange value. It is where he talks about the difference between the singularity of the way that one uses a particular thing and the fungibility of a commodity, of its comparability to all other things in the marketplace. It's where he outlines his theory of the labor theory of value. And he does all of that through, if you will remember, a description of the history of a bolt of linen. You might say, a bolt of linen? At a time when English mill hands expended the few calories they derived from American sugar in the processing of American cotton? describing an economy in which British banks yearly shipped millions of pounds of credit across the Atlantic to Ocean to the United States in return for millions of bales of cotton. In the shadow of a civil war in which Confederate policy had been premised upon the almost true idea that the disruption of the cotton trade would cause such suffering in Great Britain, where the economy was dependent on the processing of cotton, that the British would support secession, a bolt of linen. Okay. So what Marx does by focusing on a bolt of linen, which is made from flax, which is a plant indigenous to Great Britain, is he banishes the history of slavery from his history of the commodity form. He banishes cotton, right? Cotton, which was in fact the foundation of the actually existing capitalism of the 19th century, of the social conditions he set out to analyze. So he nationalizes and whitens the history of capitalism. So that is the way that I want us to understand the history of Western political economy as haunted, as invisibly orchestrated by slavery, because the actually existing social conditions that Marx was setting out to analyze, as I will explain or at least allude to in a moment, were utterly dependent upon the labor of American, and particularly United States American slaves. And yet there's an analytical banishment to the past. The simultaneity of cotton and capital are denied by the adventitious insertion of this bolt of linen. And then at the end of the book, you get the section on primitive accumulation, which banishes slavery to the past in an analytical space analogous to the history of enclosure in Great Britain. So what I want to do now is to sort of turn to that bolt of cotton, or to a bale of cotton, and to think about that. To think about that, use that cotton as a way into the world of the 19th century South, as a way into the world of Beloved. I want to start to rethink the history of Western political economy in light of its revenant blackness. One of the great things about ghost stories is you get to go in your thesaurus and check out all the fantastic words for ghost, you know, which probably you guys get to do this kind of sort of stuff all the time. It's sort of new for me. And Eidolon, you know, E-I, whatever, somebody must know how to spell Eidolon, that's a good one. Revenant is the other most awesome synonym for ghost. So what I want to talk about is revenant blackness in the political economy of slavery. Beloved occurs in the Cotton Kingdom. Beloved occurs in the emerging cotton states of the Southwest. The world of Beloved was Alabama, like Mississippi, like Louisiana. The world of the cotton boom. Now, a couple things we want to say about the cotton boom. The cotton boom represents what some scholars have come to call the second slavery within the United States. Slavery in the United States as of 1780, 1790 was more or less a dying institution. It was a decreasingly profitable institution. And indeed, Virginia slaveholders, Thomas Jefferson among them, were increasingly worried about the large numbers of unemployed enslaved people in their society. They saw them as an insurrectionary threat to their racial privilege. Cotton gave slavery new life. So the relationship between the United States South and industrial development in Great Britain is a dialectical relationship. It's a dialectical relationship which has a lot to do with the invention of the cotton gin, which if you're really, really obsessed with the agricultural history of cotton, we can talk about afterwards. But what the cotton gin does is it makes it possible to profitably cultivate cotton in North America. That is to say, it opens up a huge ecological, economic possibility for the cultivation of cotton. By 1850, 85% of the cotton produced in the United States of America was sent to Great Britain. And 85% of the cotton that was processed in Great Britain, which is to say on the vanguard of the global industrial economy of the 19th century, was produced in the United States South. Okay. What happened in between 1780 and 1850 was the expropriation of hundreds of millions of acres of Native American land. The expropriation of the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creek, the Seminole, and the Cherokee. All right? Who, if we're going to talk about ghosts, are memorialized in the ghostly presence of the names, the geography of the Deep South. Places like Tuscaloosa and Tombigbee. The slave trade to the United States from Africa was closed, legally if not practically, by an act of Congress that became effective in 1808. Which meant that this large relocation of enslaved production in the United States, this second slavery occurred, was underwritten by, occasioned, demanded, determined an internal slave trade. A vast relocation of people from places like Virginia and Maryland to Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. 1 million people between 1820 and 1860. Through an interstate slave trade. One of the largest forced migrations in human history. All right? So a place like Madison County, Mississippi in 1830 is Choctaw. And by 1835, Madison County, Mississippi has something like 3,000 enslaved people, 1,000 white people, and it's on the vanguard of a global economic boom. All right? That large-scale transformation occasioned a ecological, indeed a cellular transformation of the landscape of the Deep South. So this is the moment of Beloved. And that moment is a moment in which a woodland landscape is being stripped of trees and is in which the entire ecology of the Lower South is being put under the dominion of a single plant. Right? Slaveholders are very, very conscious of the biblical foundations of this transformation. The passages from Genesis on dominion are underlined in every Bible, as it were. But the ecological dominion is actually the dominion of the cotton crop, of monocrop. Every other plant is torn down. The landscape is reshaped by cotton. So what I first want you to imagine is a dystopic landscape. A landscape that is characterized by monocropping, by erosion, by soil exhaustion, by the pestilence that comes with the narrowing of the genetic spectrum of the plants being planted, by the floods that come with deforestation and levying of the rivers, and by starvation. The lower Mississippi Valley is one of the richest agricultural regions, potentially, on the face of the earth. But if you take all of that fertility and turn it to the cultivation of a single plant that nobody can eat, basically you're occasioning what you could call a metabolic rift. This richest of agricultural regions, through the period of the cotton boom, is dependent upon the Midwest for food. It's dependent upon the importation of food from the Midwest. Now, if you really want to get into the dynamics of 19th century agriculture, the thing that you need to think about if you were a farmer in the 19th century is manure. Right? And if your meat comes from the Midwest, it leaves its manure in the Midwest. So there's a replenishing characteristic to the animal agricultural order of the Midwest. But if you import meat from the Midwest so that you can plant all cotton, what you are effectively doing is shipping your fertility, the fertility of your soil, to Great Britain. Right? So this is a self-exhausting economy. Charles Ball, who was an enslaved person in Maryland, sold to South Carolina, described it this way: a slave employed in the culture of cotton must expect to make an acquaintance with starvation. If food is a dependent variable in a planter's calculation, every season he has to decide how much food to import from the Midwest, and that goes to an account book. He's going to push down on that threshold. He's going to push down on the threshold of what Marx called social reproduction. Right? And so what one sees again and again in the narratives of 19th century slaves is talk about hunger. Talk about hunger and acts of succor, of helping, of mercy that are materially articulated with food, materially expressed with food. Food becomes the substance of mercy. Among 19th century slaves. Frederick Douglass put this kind of relationship, I mean, I could talk infinitely about food. And so maybe those of you who have read Morrison more closely than I can, I mean, I'm just coming up with a really horrible pun, so I'm going to skip it, can express to me some of your ideas about food in Morrison, and then I can talk about food and slavery. Frederick Douglass put it this way: slaves are food for the cotton fields. So he collapsed that metabolic rift. I was going to talk for maybe about 5 more minutes about the connections between Liverpool and Louisiana, Manchester, and Mississippi as a way to try to materially express this world for you. Because what I want to suggest is that, as I did at the beginning, the separation of capitalism and slavery into two different things is analytically adventitious. And then, in fact, what there is an actually existing political economy of the 19th century. And that actually existing political economy of the 19th century is one that stretches from Liverpool to Louisiana, and one that we might productively term something like slave racial capitalism. Just like one thing, right? It has differences. It has differences in the modes of production. Has different currencies. Has different standards for what makes a day's work. But what I want to talk about First, I want to talk about the ecological disciplinary aspect of the Cotton Kingdom. And then I want to talk about those connections. Two things, 2.5 minutes apiece. The landscape of the Cotton Kingdom, the landscape inhabited, the landscape in which Beloved is set, is a landscape that is not simply an agro-capitalist landscape, it is a landscape of counterinsurgency. When you cut down all of the trees and plant everything in rows of cotton, you create a landscape of visual surveillance. So, if you read slave narratives, one of the things that comes through the narratives is the sense, enslaved people sense that they are always being watched. And if you think of the images that you've seen of enslaved people working in cotton fields, what you think is you see rows of people working their way along rows. Well, that's a visual way to control the pace of labor, right? You can see who is keeping up with who. That means that you can punish one person to make them work harder, faster, and then you have a visual way of comparing their work rate to everybody else. I mean, enslaving power is visual power. If you think about color coding, you think about the way in which there is an ascription of physiological character, moral character, intellectual character, sexual character to people on the basis of skin color, right? And then you think about the way in which people are disciplined in fields. And we could go on with the visual character of slaveholding power. Probably we wouldn't need to look a whole lot further than the word overseer. Right? It's not an accidental word. Or slaveholders, when they think that people are shirking, refer to those people as providing eye service, as looking like they're serving to the eye. But at the edge of those cotton fields were a couple of different kinds of landscapes. A residual landscape, a non-transformed landscape. Forests and swamps. Forests that had not yet been cut down, swamps that had not been yet been drained. Right? Also, an emergent post-capitalist landscape. What happens after you ruin the soil? After you plant cotton so many times that you can't grow cotton anymore, you move on. That's one of the reasons that the Southern slaveholding regime is so expansive. They're exhausting the soil, so they're expanding to new soil, rather than rotating the landscape through the field by planting, cotton, then beans, then cotton, then beans. They're just moving the field across the landscape. There's a very direct connection, that is to say, one that we could talk about, between the political economy of slavery and U.S. imperialism in the 19th century. The pivot being partly soil exhaustion. So that's a long way around the question of what is a post-capitalist landscape in the 19th century South, and what a post-capitalist landscape is just like scrubby trees. It's called old field. All right? So the landscape of cotton is checkered in with these other kinds of landscapes, this residual forest swamp landscape and this post-capitalist scrubby tree pine brake landscape. Well, when slaves run away, obviously on one level they run into the woods, right? Well, the woods, swamps are interesting because woods and swamps occlude slaveholders' visual power. They make it impossible for slaveholders to govern by seeing. And those are landscapes instead of sound. So if you read the 19th century narratives, what you see, they're full of sounds. Slaves who are in the woods listen. They gain a tactical advantage by being able to listen. To reassert authority over the landscape, slaveholders used dogs. They switched the sensory landscape again to one that is characterized by smell. All right? So in closing, I want to try to tie Liverpool to Louisiana through to you by talking about the particularity of the cotton plant. The plant that is holding the lower South under its dominion was a cotton plant of a very particular sort, a very particular hybridized strain that was invented in Rodney, Mississippi, and patented. It's a new thing under the sun. It's called Petit Gulf cotton, and it's prized for its pickability. That's when people write about Petit Gulf cotton, or in French, Petit Gulf cotton. They talk about its pickability, and what they mean when they say that the cotton is pickable is they mean that the bowl of the cotton opens up very widely, and that the fibers are attached to it very loosely, that they pull out very easily. So what they have in mind when they hybridize this plant is a different sort of hybrid. It's an ecological human hybrid. They have in mind the capacity of a human hand in relationship to the capacity of a plant, and that's the plant that remakes this world, and in the process remakes the material circumstances and the actually existing human bodies of the people who are employed under its dominion. Now, the thing about Petit Gulf cotton is that it opens so wide and it blows away so easily that when it blooms in the field, in order to be harvested, it needs to be picked quickly. Because if it's not picked quickly, the bowl that opens is going to get dust blown into it, or the fibers are going to blow away, or it's going to rain and there's going to be a mud puddle at the bottom of the cotton plant, and the new drops, the other drops of rain are going to come down, they're going to splash up and get muddy water onto the open cotton plant. Well, as it turns out, the merchantability, the marketability of cotton on the exchange in Liverpool depends precisely upon it not being stained, upon its pure whiteness. Right? So when we see slaveholders driving people to pick more, faster, better, cleaner cotton, we need to imagine that they're doing that for some kind of reason. It's not simply that they are all psychotic, although a very large proportion of them may have been. It's because they have in their mind a market standard that is set on an exchange in Liverpool about fair cotton, middling cotton, high quality cotton, poor cotton. All of those different things have prices. Right? So what we see in the discipline of labor in Louisiana is the presence of the market standard in Liverpool, translated through a series of measures. High grade, medium grade, middling grade, pounds and pence, dollars and cents, pounds of cotton, lashes for coming up short at the end of the day. Right? There's a series of translating terms that make this into a single economic space. And so it's that sort of dominion, the global dominion of the cotton plant, that I want to use to shadow our reading, to haunt our reading. of Beloved, and really of all of American history.